Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Histories. Close your eyes and imagine the rogue hero of the high seas. A figure in a tricorn hat, standing defiantly amidst a chest of shimmering Aztec gold, a parrot on his shoulder as he sails toward a horizon of tropical freedom and eternal adventure. But the real life of a pirate during the Golden Age was far from a romantic getaway. It was a relentless cycle of biological attrition, tactical desperation, and the pungent reality of salt and tar. So tonight, we will leave the legends behind and see what it was really like. We will explore the specialized chemistry used to seal a rotting ship's hull, the democratic but brutal social contracts signed in blood, and the terrifying sensory theater of Blackbeard's smoky psychological warfare. Please like and subscribe to join our crew, and share your location and time in the comments below. The mid-17th century marks a seismic shift in the geopolitical topography of the Caribbean. You observe the transition in the year 1650, where the waters of the West Indies serve no longer as a mere colonial thoroughfare, but as a crucible for a new kind of maritime existence. This era, known specifically as the buccaneering period, spans from 1650 to 1680, acting as the foundational precursor to the more organized pirate rounds of the following century. Unlike the state-sanctioned privateers who operate under a commission, the letter of marque issued by a sovereign crown, this new breed of mariner operates for personal profit. Every ounce of silver, every barrel of indigo, and every bolt of canvas seized from a hull is the direct property of the men who spilled blood for it. You witness the birth of the golden age of piracy, a nearly 80-year epoch reaching into the 1730s, defined by the systematic rejection of European hegemony. Life aboard these vessels is a relentless grind of physics and biological attrition. You observe the rigging, thick with dried salt and tar, straining under the pressure of a tropical squall. Above you, the heavy canvas snaps in a salt-heavy gale, a sound like an iron-shod musket crack that vibrates through the deck, plating, and into the soles of your feet. This sound is the primary acoustic signature of the maritime frontier. The air you breathe is a pressurized mixture of evaporating brine, the humid rot of standing bilge water, and the pungent oaken scent of the ship's hull. The buccaneers, originally named for the boucan, the wooden frame used for smoking meat on Hispaniola, have migrated from hunters of feral cattle to hunters of Spanish plate fleets. They have traded the land-based smoke of the tanneries for the sulphurous haze of the 12-pounder cannon. The most critical evolution of this period, however, is not found in the ballistics or the rigging, but in the psychological mechanism of the flag. This is a technical necessity of maritime warfare. You watch as a lookout identifies a silhouette on the horizon. To engage in a direct, prolonged broadside battle is economically inefficient. It damages the prize, wastes expensive black powder, and risks the lives of a limited crew. To solve this, the pirates develop a visual language of terror designed specifically to induce fear and avoid unnecessary combat. In the early decades, you see the Jolie Rouge, the pretty red flag. This solid crimson cloth communicates a singular binary message, no quarter. It signifies that should the target resist, no lives will be spared upon boarding. Historically, this red flag serves as the brutal predecessor to the more intricate iconography of the Black Banner. As the 1680s approach, the evolution of this symbolism reaches its zenith in the form of the black skull and bones. You observe the quartermaster unfolding a length of heavy dyed wool. The shift from red to black is a calculated shift in tactical communication. While the red flag promised certain death during battle, the black flag, the Jolly Roger, serves as a grim invitation to surrender. It signals that if the merchant vessel strikes its colors immediately, the crew will be spared and only the cargo taken. You see the technical precision of this fear tactic by projecting an aura of inevitable violence through the image of the white skull, the skeleton, or the hourglass. The pirate captain often secures his victory without firing a single shot. This efficiency allows the pirate republic to flourish, as vessels are captured intact and crews are often recruited from the ranks of the surrendered. The sociology of these ships represents a radical departure from the naval stratification of the time. While a sailor in the Royal Navy is subject to the whims of an appointed officer and the draconian lash of the Articles of War, the pirate operates under a contract of his own making. You watch as the crew gathers on the main deck, their skin weathered to the texture of cured leather. They are drafting a social hierarchy based on merit and mutual risk rather than birthright or royal decree. In these floating republics, the captain's power is absolute only in the heat of chase or combat. In all other matters, the will of the majority dictates the course of the ship. This is a demographic of outcasts, disgraced sailors, escaped bondsmen, and those who have found the sovereign's laws to be a yoke they can no longer bear. The transition from privateering to piracy is thus complete. You see the ledger now, gripped by a man with fingers stained by ink and gunpowder, tracking the distribution of pieces of 8 and the specific compensation rates for the loss of a limb. This is not a chaotic mob, but a structured organization of professional thieves. The transition from the chaos of boarding to the structured governance of a captured vessel is marked by a shift in authority. Once the smoke of the engagement dissipates, the visual identity of the ship is no longer defined by the flag above, but by the document below. You observe the transition from a group of individuals to a legal collective through the drafting and enforcement of the ship's articles. This document serves as a foundational contract, a proto-democratic constitution that dictates every facet of life and labor within the pirate company. Unlike the naval or merchant services of the late 17th century, where the captain's word was absolute and backed by the sovereign state, the pirate vessel operated as a self-governing entity. You watch as a clerk or quartermaster prepares the workspace. The scratching of a quill on rough, dry parchment is the only sound in the cabin, a sound that formalizes the social contract between the men. This document required the signature of every member of the crew. For those who were illiterate, a simple X served as their binding oath. Signing the articles was not a mere formality. It was a voluntary entry into a collective governed by law rather than whim. The Articles of Democracy established a power structure that was radically horizontal for the era. The technical mechanism of this governance was the Pirate Council. This body was composed of every single crew member, regardless of their rank or previous status on land. You observe the council in session. Major decisions such as where to cruise for prizes, whether to grant quarter to a surrendering ship, or how to handle an internal dispute are resolved through a majority vote. The captain, while the supreme commander during the tactical exertion of a chase or battle, held no such absolute power during the mundane operations of the voyage. The crew selected their leaders and, crucially, maintained the power to remove them. You see the mechanics of accountability in action. If a captain displayed cowardice, cruelty, or mismanagement, the crew could vote him out and replace him with a more competent individual. This democratic oversight extended to the role of the quartermaster, who acted as a check on the captain's power and served as the representative of the crew's interests. The quartermaster was responsible for the distribution of supplies and the adjudication of minor grievances, ensuring that the captain did not monopolize the resources of the ship. This was a system of checks and balances at sea. Beyond political governance, the ship's articles functioned as a sophisticated insurance policy and a system of social welfare. Piracy was a high-risk economic venture involving extreme physical hazards. To mitigate these risks and ensure the continued loyalty of the crew, the articles included a specific compensatory structure for injuries sustained in the line of duty. This was a form of disability compensation that far predated modern industrial safety nets. You see the quartermaster recording the inventory of the medicinal chest and the compensation funds. According to the articles, a pirate who lost a limb during a raid received $800 in disability compensation, paid out of the common treasury before any other loot was divided. Similar specific amounts were designated for the loss of an eye or a finger. This was a calculated economic necessity. A crew that knew they would be cared for after a maiming was a crew more likely to engage in the violent, high-stakes maneuvers required for a successful boarding. The metallic scent of blood from the recent skirmish still lingers in the wood of the decks, providing a stark justification for these legal clauses. The compensation was not an act of charity, obligation of the company. The logic of the articles ensured that the interests of the individual were inextricably tied to the success of the collective. This socio-political organization was a direct response to the oppressive hierarchies of the British Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine, where sailors were often subjected to arbitrary floggings and the withholding of wages. In the pirate company, the division of spoils was strictly codified. The captain and quartermaster might receive 2 shares, the master mate and gunner 1.5, and the common crew 1 share each. This narrow pay gap stands in clinical contrast to the vast wealth disparity found in legal maritime commerce. Every man was a stakeholder in the venture. You observe the focus of the men as the articles are read aloud one final time. It is a moment of cold, pragmatic agreement. With the signatures dry and the council's authority established, the internal social order is secured. The crew is no longer a mob of mutineers, but a defined corporation with a clear mandate. This legal framework provides the stability necessary for the survival of the enterprise in a hostile maritime environment. With a code of conduct established, the pirates turned their attention to the machines they called home. The democratic structure established by the ship's articles provides the social cohesion necessary for survival, but the physical survival of the crew depends entirely on the hydrodynamics of the vessel itself. You observe the pirate sloop, a stolen merchant craft now undergoing a transformation into a specialized instrument of predation. These vessels, typically ranging from 9 to 21 meters in length, are chosen for their shallow draft and high maneuverability. To the pirate, a ship is not merely a home, it is a tactical asset that must be hollowed out and hardened for the singular purpose of pursuit and escape. You walk the deck and notice the physical manifestations of this philosophy. The bulky, ornate cabins that once housed merchant captains and their luxuries have been methodically dismantled. The removal of these structures reduces top weight and, more importantly, clears the deck to accommodate a larger complement of heavy guns. Every square meter of the ship is repurposed to facilitate the movement of men and the deployment of iron. This is no longer a carrier of salt and silk. It is a platform for violence. However, the greatest threat to the vessel's efficacy is invisible, lurking beneath the waterline. Even the most modified sloop is subject to the relentless biological degradation of the ocean. You watch as the crew prepares for the technical necessity of careening. The ship is navigated into a secluded shallow bay, a location chosen because the hull's design allows it to venture where deeper drafted Royal Navy frigates would run aground. The process is a feat of engineering and raw physical labor. The crew must wait for the tide to recede, beaching the ship on a soft sandbar. You observe the rigging being utilized in a different capacity. Heavy tackles are attached to the masts and anchored to sturdy trees or buried anchors on the shore. With rhythmic, synchronized hauling, the pirates heave the massive vessel onto its side, exposing the belly of the predator to the open air. The ship lies vulnerable, tilted at a sharp angle, revealing the secrets hidden under months of salt water. As the hull breaks the surface, the extent of the damage becomes clear. The wood is encrusted with a thick, calcified layer of barnacles and seaweed, which creates immense drag and can reduce a ship's speed by several knots. The difference between a successful haul and a gibbet at execution dock. Far more insidious are the Teredo navalis, or shipworms. These wood-boring mollusks penetrate the oak planking, carving out intricate labyrinthine tunnels that structurally compromise the timber. Without constant maintenance, a hull can become a brittle honeycomb, prone to catastrophic failure under the pressure of the sea. You see the crew wielding scrapers and long-handled brushes, a grueling labor intended to strip the hull back to the bare wood. And the men work in the mud and the wet sand, their hands raw from the sharp edges of shells, fighting against the decay that threatens to sink them before a single shot is fired. Once the wood is scraped clean, the preservation process begins. This is where the sensory reality of the pirates' work becomes overwhelming. You observe the cauldrons bubbling over open fires on the beach. The air is thick with a pungent, choking smell of boiling tar and sulfur. This acrid mixture is combined with tallow-rendered animal fat to create a toxic, water-repellent coating. The sulfur acts as a primitive pesticide to deter shipworms, while the tallow provides a smooth, slick surface to enhance speed through the water. The heat from the tar pits radiates against your skin, and the thick, black smoke clings to your lungs. Every inch of the exposed hull is slathered in this hot, viscous sealant. Once one side is treated, the ship is righted, turned, and the grueling process is repeated. They are maintaining the only piece of technology that grants them agency in a world that has otherwise discarded them. The ship is now lean, fast, and level. Yet, the physical optimization of timber is only half the equation. A fast ship is useless without a crew, and the Royal Navy was providing the perfect recruits through brutality. By 1715, the structural integrity of a vessel, maintained through the grueling labor of careening and the application of sulfur, determined the survival of its crew. However, a ship is a hollow shell without the specialized labor force required to operate its complex rigging and ordnance. You find yourself in the port of Bristol, or perhaps London's Wapping district, where the labor market for the Royal Navy and the merchant service is governed not by contract but by coercion. The logistical demands of the British Empire necessitate a constant influx of able seamen, and when the supply of volunteers fails to meet the Admiralty's quotas, the state resorts to the press gang. This is a legal mechanism of forced recruitment where a naval officer and a squad of armed men patrol the dockside taverns and alleyways. You observe the recruitment process in its most primal form. A press gang corners a merchant sailor, and you hear the dull thud of a weighted wooden club against the man's skull. This strike is a functional tool of the trade, designed to incapacitate the subject long enough to transport him to a waiting tender. Upon waking, the sailor is no longer a free agent of commerce. He is a servant of the crown, bound to a life of scurvy pathology, high-density living, and the constant threat of the lash. The merchant service offers little respite from this cycle of exploitation. To maintain their margins, merchant captains employ systematic trickery to fill their muster rolls. You see the implementation of crimping, where tavern owners and agents collaborate to induce a state of profound intoxication in young men. Once the subject is incapacitated by alcohol, his mark is forged on a contract, or he is simply carried aboard a departing vessel. By the time the sea fog clears from his mind, the coastline is a memory, and he is legally bound to a captain who holds absolute authority over his wages and physical person. These ships are floating sites of extraction where the labor is relentless and the provisions are frequently infested with weevils. The wage system is equally predatory. Months of hazardous work can be voided by a captain's whim or the loss of the vessel, leaving the sailor with no capital after years of service. It is within this socio-economic pressure cooker that the alternative of piracy shifts from a criminal enterprise to a rational economic choice. To the merchant sailor, the pirate ship represents a departure from the vertical hierarchy of the state and the merchant class. When a pirate vessel intercepts a merchantman, the recruitment phase begins with a technical assessment of the crew's specialized skills. You watch as the pirate boarding party ignores the general laborers and focuses their attention on the most valuable assets, the surgeons, and of the most valuable assets, the surgeons prosecuted by hand, whose knowledge of trauma surgery and pharmacology is essential for surviving naval engagements, the carpenters, who possess the unique engineering skills required to repair hull breaches under fire, and the navigators, who can operate quadrants and interpret nautical charts. These men are often pressed into pirate service, but the coercion is frequently a facade. By pretending to be forced, these specialists provide themselves with a legal defense, a claim of duress, should they ever be captured and tried for felony. Yet for many, the transition is voluntary. They are drawn to the Articles, which guarantee a democratic distribution of plunder and a rudimentary form of disability insurance, a specific payout of 800 pieces of 8 for the loss of a limb or an eye. This is a radical departure from the king's shilling and the arbitrary discipline of the merchant service. The demographic of the Caribbean is rapidly being reshaped by these refugees of the maritime industry. Men who have spent their lives as the human fuel for European empires are now centralizing their power. They are disillusioned by the grand design of the colonies and the predatory recruitment tactics that placed them on these decks. They have survived the clubs of the press gangs and the deceptive bottles of the merchant agents, emerging with a profound cynicism toward the law of the land. You see them gathered in the shadows of the lower decks, swapping the technical jargon of their trades for a new language of maritime rebellion. They are no longer isolated laborers. They are becoming a cohesive, militarized collective. This consolidation of disgruntled, highly skilled sailors created a vacuum in the legal order of the Atlantic. These broken men found a new, terrifying identity under the leadership of a man named Edward Teach. The years between 1680 and 1718 represent a shift in maritime predation from mere theft to a systematic implementation of psychological operations. As the specialized laborers forced into service by the press gangs of the early 18th century looked for liberation, they found it under commanders who understood that victory was most efficiently achieved when the enemy's will was broken before the first shot was fired. No figure utilized this stratagem with more calculated precision than Edward Teach, the mariner known as Blackbeard. You observe Teach not as a chaos-driven marauder, but as a master of theatrical intimidation, a man who transformed his own body into a visual instrument of terror. To cultivate a reputation of supernatural malice, Teach would take lengths of slow-burning hemp matches, fuses normally used for the ignition of great guns, and tuck them beneath the brim of his hat. As these fuses smoldered, they emitted a thick sulphurous haze that wreathed his head in a continuous shroud of grey vapor. The acrid, stinging smoke of these slow-burning fuses near the face creates a constant, irritating haze, forcing the eyes to water and the lungs to tighten. Yet Teach remains motionless within the cloud, a figure of stoic, suffocating discipline. This performance was not merely for vanity. It was a calibrated component of the tactical doctrine governing pirate engagements during this era. An attack frequently followed a predefined sequence of escalation, designed to minimize damage to the prize vessel's cargo and hull. The first stage of this sequence was the hoisting of the Jolly Roger. While various designs existed, Edward Teach's personal ensign was a masterpiece of symbolic communication. You see the black fabric unfurl, revealing a white skeleton that holds an hourglass in one hand, symbolizing that the victim's time has run out, while the other hand stabs a spear into a bleeding heart. The message was mathematically clear. Resistance would result in the total cessation of life. If the merchant vessel did not strike its colors upon seeing the flag, the pirates moved to the second stage of their assault, which involved the deployment of advanced explosive ordnance known as grenadiers. These early hand grenades were primitive but devastatingly effective for deck-clearing operations. A grenado typically consisted of a hollowed-out iron sphere or a thick-walled glass bottle filled with high-velocity black powder. To increase the lethality of the device, pirates would pack the container with jagged scrap metal, lead shot or shards of glass. You observe the pirate crew lighting the short fuses and hurling these devices onto the crowded merchant deck. Upon impact, the containment vessel shatters, transforming into a spray of kinetic projectiles that shred sails and pierce the flesh of any sailors standing within the blast radius. The sound is not a low rumble but a sharp, ear-splitting crack that leaves a metallic tang of saltpeter in the air. This barrage served to disorient the defenders, allowing the pirate boarding party to cross the gunwales amidst the confusion of smoke and shrapnel. For the merchant sailor, the sight of a smoke-wreathed Edward Teach emerging through the haze of a grenado blast often led to an immediate surrender. However, the efficacy of this theater of terror was ultimately finite. By 1718, the British Crown had grown weary of the disruption to the lucrative triangular trade routes and the escalating costs of marine insurance. The Royal Navy was dispatched with orders to eliminate the pirate threat with terminal prejudice. This directive led to the violent final battle on November 22, 1718, at Ocracoke Inlet. You track the movements of Lieutenant Robert Maynard as he commands two small sloops, the Ranger and the Jane, into the shallow North Carolina waters. Unlike previous encounters, the theater of terror failed to break the resolve of the naval personnel. The engagement was a grueling display of close-quarters combat involving small arms and cutlasses. Teach was reportedly shot 5 times and stabbed 20 more before finally collapsing on the deck. His death marked the conclusion of a specific era of piracy, characterized by high-profile, individualist commanders who relied on the marriage of violence and performance art. While Blackbeard ruled through fear, others sought a more permanent sanctuary on the shores of Madagascar. The year is 1690. You are navigating the jagged eastern coastline of Madagascar, a massive landmass strategically positioned along the lucrative trade routes of the Indian Ocean. Following the decline of Atlantic dominance, the focus of maritime predation shifts here to the deep bays and dense forests of the world's fourth largest island. In this remote theater, a narrative emerges that blurs the line between geopolitical reality and philosophical fiction. The legend of Libertalia. According to accounts, a French officer named James Misson has purportedly established a colony rooted in radical egalitarianism. You are told of a place where the social hierarchies of the 17th century are dismantled, where the articles of the ship become the law of the land, and where the term pirate is replaced by liberi. In this account, Misson and his crew, along with an Italian priest, create a society that abolishes slavery, practices common ownership of property, and builds a fortified harbor. You observe the conceptual framework of a republic that serves as a direct antithesis to the monarchical autocracies of Europe. However, as you move through the physical topography of the Madagascar coastline, the technical logistics of such a settlement encounter the friction of historical scrutiny. While the legend of Libertalia provides a potent ideological archetype, modern historians identify it as a literary invention, a myth likely designed to critique contemporary European governance. The archival record remains silent on James Misson, lacking any naval commission or birth certificate to ground his existence in fact. Instead of a flourishing democratic city-state, you encounter the reality of the pirate round outposts. These are not grand marble republics, but utilitarian logistics hubs and careening stations. You see the technical reality of ship maintenance. Vessels are run aground on sloping beaches so that hulls can be scraped of barnacles and the shipworm that consumes tropical timbers. The air is heavy with the smell of boiling pitch and the acrid smoke of fires used to char and seal the wooden planks. The dream of a utopia is replaced by the grime of maritime labor. By the dawn of the 18th century, the logistical stability of these Madagascar bases begins a rapid degradation. The decline is not the result of a single decisive battle, but a steady erosion caused by internal fragmentation and the complex dynamics of the indigenous population. You observe the dissolution of cohesion as pirate crews, initially welcomed for their trade goods and gunpowder, enter into escalating conflicts with the local Malagasy tribes. The technical advantage of European flintlocks is offset by the logistical isolation of the pirates. They are thousands of miles from the foundries of Europe, and their supplies of high-quality saltpeter for gunpowder are finite. Disputes over land use, livestock, and the interference in local tribal politics led to a state of perpetual attrition. Internal fractures also play a critical role, as the lack of a centralized authority, the very freedom the Libertalia myth celebrated, results in the splintering of crews into small competing factions. The utopia is eating itself from the inside out. As you survey the coastline by 1711, the transformation is complete. The expansive settlements and fortified docks described in the legends have vanished. In their place, the operational capacity of the Madagascar pirates has collapsed. You find only a few documented individuals remaining, men described in contemporary reports as poor and despicable. They have survived not by conquest, but by complete integration into local societies or by eking out a subsistence existence on the margins of the jungle. The structural mechanisms of piracy, the ability to careen ships, recruit fresh labor, and fence stolen goods, have moved elsewhere. The silence of the jungle is now the dominant auditory feature of the landscape. You walk through the remnants of a shoreline camp, where the tropical humidity has accelerated the rot of abandoned wooden structures, the timber yielding to the damp earth in a process of organic reclamation. The dream of a landed utopia proved incompatible with the volatile nature of the pirate economy. As the utopias crumbled, The seas saw the rise of the most successful pirate in history, Black Bart. The collapse of static colonies like the legendary Libertalia forced a transition back to a purely nomadic existence. By 1719, the Atlantic had become the primary laboratory for a high-efficiency model of maritime predation, led by a man whose operational success eclipsed all his predecessors. You are observing the peak of this era on board the Royal Fortune, the flagship of Bartholomew Roberts, better known as Black Bart. Between 1719 and 1722, Roberts would capture over times 400 vessels, a logistical feat that required more than just brute force. It necessitated a complex administrative structure to manage a fleet that often exceeded most national coast guards in the region. Hawking across the main deck, you notice the sheer density of the crew. Unlike merchant vessels that operated with skeleton crews of 15 to 20 men to maximize profit margins, Roberts maintained a standing force of over 200 men. This high manning level was a tactical necessity designed to intimidate prizes into surrendering without a shot being fired, but it created an immense burden on internal resources and space. The stratification of this crew is visually and statistically distinct. In 1721, careful analysis of the muster rolls reveals that 28% of Roberts' crew was black. Many were former slaves liberated or recruited from captured Royal African Company ships. And on a pirate deck, the racial hierarchy of the plantation system was replaced by a functional meritocracy dictated by the ship's articles. In the shadows of the gun deck, you see these men working alongside European sailors, mending heavy canvas sails and maintaining the 40 cannons that gave the flagship its lethal reputation. The order of the ship is maintained through the Articles of Agreement, a precursor to modern maritime law. You observe the quartermaster, the elected representative of the crew, overseeing the daily distribution of victuals and tasks. In this environment, the captain's power is not absolute. It is a delegated authority that exists only during the heat of a chase or battle. Every decision regarding the ship's destination or the engagement of a target is put to a vote. This democratic framework was the only mechanism capable of preventing mutiny among 200 heavily armed men packed into a confined wooden hull. The air in these quarters is stagnant, a thick mixture of unwashed bodies. The pungent aroma of salted beef and the sharp, acidic tang of cheap West Indian rum used to purify the brackish drinking water. Following a successful engagement, the atmosphere shifts from tactical discipline to the rigorous accounting of spoils. You watch as the crew assembles for the division of booty. The methodology is clinical and mathematically precise, unlike the privateers of the previous century or the Royal Navy, where the lion's share of prize money was funneled to high-ranking officers and investors. Roberts' crew practiced a radical form of economic egalitarianism. The division of booty was nearly equal. While a common sailor received 1 share, the captain and the quartermaster received only 2 shares. Specialized roles, such as the master, the boatswain, and the carpenter, were allocated 1.5 shares. This narrow pay gap served as the primary incentive for recruitment, offering a financial mobility that was impossible in the rigid class structures of the 18th century British Empire. You hear the rhythmic clink of silver coins being counted into leather pouches. The sound is steady and metallic, punctuating the low murmurs of the men as they verify the weight of Spanish pieces of 8 and Portuguese moidores. The quartermaster uses a set of brass scales to ensure the silver is distributed to the milligram, as any perceived unfairness could ignite a violent insurrection. This wealth, however, is often fleeting. Without a stable port or a banking system, survival depends on the constant motions of the great fleet. Robert's success was such that he effectively paralyzed trade between the Caribbean and the African coast, forcing the British Admiralty to send a dedicated task force to eliminate the threat. The end of this organizational masterpiece came with jarring finality in February 1722. Off Cape Lopez, Gabon, Robert's fleet was intercepted by the HMS Swallow, a 50-gun fourth-rate ship of the line. You are present on the deck as the first broadside tears through the air. Roberts, dressed in his finest crimson damask waistcoat and a gold chain, stands on the bridge to signal defiance. However, the technical superiority of the Navy's long-range gunnery proves decisive. A blast of grape shot strikes Roberts in the throat, killing him instantly. Following his standing orders, his crew immediately threw his body overboard to prevent the Royal Navy from displaying his corpse as a trophy. The death of Bartholomew Roberts in 1722 signaled the terminal decline of the golden age of piracy. With the most successful commander gone, the survivors faced the gallows in the largest mass execution of pirates in history at Cape Coast Castle. Even the most successful crews faced a silent internal enemy that no cannon could defeat. The death of Bartholomew Roberts and the dispersal of his fleet in 1722 left a vacuum in the Atlantic. But for the sailors who remained at sea, the greatest threat was not the Royal Navy's broadsides, but the slow, biological degradation of the human body. As the weeks of a voyage stretch into months, the ship ceases to be a vessel of liberation and becomes a floating laboratory of pathology. You occupy a cramped space in the lower decks, where the air is a stagnant soup of unwashed bodies, stagnant bilge water, and the ammonia of urine. The structural integrity of the ship, built of oak and pine, is sound, yet the biological integrity of the crew is failing. This is the physiological cost of the golden age of piracy, a state of permanent, systemic decay known as the floating pestilence. Nutrition on a long-haul voyage is a mathematical impossibility. The primary sustenance is the hard-tacked biscuit, a kiln-dried mixture of flour and water designed for shelf life rather than edibility. You lift a piece to your mouth, and as you bite down, you experience the distinct rhythmic crunch of live weevils and maggots nesting within the flour. The insects provide a marginal, unintended source of protein, but they are a testament to the age of the stores. The salt pork and beef, kept in brine-filled barrels for years, have turned a dull, iridescent grey. The fibers of the meat are so tough they resemble the hempen rope of the rigging more than muscle tissue. To consume these rations is to invite a chemical imbalance that the body understands through the onset of scurvy, and scurvy represents the literal dissolution of the body's connective tissues. It begins with a profound lethargy, a heaviness in the limbs that no amount of sleep can alleviate. You observe a shipmate as he attempts to speak. His gums are swollen and spongy, a dark purple hue that bleeds at the slightest vibration of the ship. One by one, his teeth loosen in their sockets and fall onto the deck planks with a dry, hollow sound. The most terrifying aspect of this nutritional collapse is the memory of the body. Scurvy targets the collagen that holds scars together. You look down at your own arm at a wound received years ago in a boarding action that had long since healed into a thin white line. Under the pressure of the disease, the old scar begins to redden, soften, and eventually reopens, the body forgetting how to remain whole. Internal hemorrhaging manifests as large, dark bruises that bloom across the shins and thighs without any external trauma. While the body breaks from within, the environment of the ship attacks from without. Hydration is a lethal necessity. The water supply, stored in wooden leaguers in the dark, humid hold, has long since become a breeding ground for microorganisms. The liquid is thick, ropey with algae, and smells of sulfur and rot. It is common practice for sailors to hold their breath or strain the water through their teeth to catch the larger contaminants, but the microscopic pathogens remain. To avoid the dysentery that thrives in these casks, crews turn to alcohol, rum, grog, or watered-down beer as their primary source of liquid intake. This leads to a state of perpetual low-level dehydration and neurological impairment, which only accelerates the physical decline. The steady rhythm of the ship's roll is punctuated by the sound of men retching into the scuppers, their digestive tracts failing under the weight of bacterial infection. You share your sleeping quarters with more than just men. The hold is a thriving ecosystem of vermin. Rats and cockroaches move with impunity through the shadows. These scavengers are the primary vectors for external pestilence. Typhus is transmitted by the lice that move from the rats to the sailors' wool garments. It manifests as a high burning fever, turning the crowded forecastle into a ward of delirium. Dysentery spreads through the contamination of food and the lack of any sanitary infrastructure. You are constantly surrounded by the smell of acidic vomit and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. The technical reality of maritime life is defined by this constant struggle against entropy. You see the results of this attrition during the morning watch. The crew that once numbered 80 is now reduced to 40 capable hands. The rest are idlers, confined to their hammocks, their bodies turning into masses of bruised flesh and weeping sores. The ship itself begins to mirror the men. The wood is bored by shipworms, and the sails are thinning. This bravado of the black flag is replaced by a somber, grinding endurance. Disease weakened them, but the arrival of Woody's Rogers and the law would finally break them. The year 1718 marks the definitive shift from maritime anarchy to the re-establishment of imperial bureaucracy. You've observed the arrival of Governor Woodes Rogers in Nassau, a man whose arrival signals the legislative and physical demolitive Republic of Pirates. Rogers, himself a former privateer, who understood the logistical weaknesses of the outcasts, arrived with a mandate of total reclamation. The transition is not merely political, it is mechanical. The harbour, once a sanctuary for unregulated trade and the repair of hull fouling, is now subject to the strictures of British Admiralty law. The amnesty offered by the King's pardon acts as a centrifuge, spinning away those unwilling to submit and leaving behind a concentrated, desperate core of holdouts who choose the risk of the noose over the certainty of the ledger. As the state reclaims the Caribbean, the nature of naval engagement shifts toward total suppression. You are standing on the pier as the Union Jack is raised, watching the old world of the outcasts begin to burn under the cold gaze of the law. You witness the technical brutality of the grappé shot, a projectile system consisting of clusters of small iron balls wrapped in canvas and tied with cord, resembling a bunch of grapes. When fired from a long 9 cannon, the canvas disintegrates, and the balls scatter in a widening cone of kinetic energy. The screaming whistle of grape shot tearing through the air is the sound of industrial-scale anti-personnel warfare. It does not aim to sink the ship, but to strip the deck of its human occupants. You see the result on the planks, the shredding of hempen rope and the pulverization of oak railings, followed by the immediate neutralization of the crew. This is followed by the deployment of grappling hooks, 4-pronged iron anchors attached to heavy lines, hurled by hand to lock the two vessels in a fatal embrace. The mechanical tension in the ropes as the ships grind together signifies the end of maneuverability and the beginning of the final boarding action. The air is thick with the smell of sulfur and the splintering of wood and equipic. In October 1720, this tactical reality catches up with the crew of the William at Bry Harbor, Jamaica. You observe the ship of John Calico Jack Rackham as it is intercepted by the sloop under the command of Jonathan Barney. The engagement is brief. Rackham and his male crew members, compromised by the consumption of large quantities of rum, retreat to the hold. However, the resistance remains on deck in the form of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. You see them wielding cutlasses and pistols, the only members of the crew providing a tactical defense against the boarding party. The disparity in resolve is recorded in the trial documents, noting that the women fought with a ferocity the men could no longer muster. Following their capture, both Bonny and Read utilized a specific legal maneuver known as pleading their bellies. Their executions were formally delayed by the Court of Vice Admiralty due to their pregnancies, a biological reprieve that separated their fate from the men they sailed with. Charles Vane, once a dominant force, suffered a loss of political capital within his own ranks. You see Vane deposed, replaced by his quartermaster, Rackham, and cast adrift. His journey concludes not in glory but in the sterile environment of a gallows at Gallows Point, Port Royal, in 1721. The technical process of the long drop was not yet standard. Instead, the short drop method ensured a slow death by strangulation, a final demonstration of the state's power. Between 1718 and 1724, the structural integrity of the pirate brotherhood eroded until only fragments remained. The Republic was no longer a geographical location, but a dwindling list of names on a bounty sheet. Each capture followed a predictable sequence: the discharge of the grape shot, the securing of the grappling hooks, and the inevitable surrender. The technological and legal machinery of the British Empire proved more durable than the social contract of the outcasts. The battle was over. All that remained was the long walk to the gallows. By 1724, the administrative machinery of the British Empire had refined the process of maritime execution into a standardized ritual of state power. You observe the transition of the pirate from a living predator to a literary commodity with the publication of a general history of the pirates in 1724. This volume, attributed to Captain Charles Johnson, began the immediate process of mythologizing the era even as the flesh and blood subjects of its pages were being hunted to extinction. The text served as a bridge between the raw violence of the Caribbean and the drawing rooms of London, transforming desperate maritime laborers into romanticized outlaws of the high seas. While the public consumed these serialized accounts of adventure, the physical reality for the captured remained confined to the cold, damp stone of colonial jails and the rigid protocols of the Admiralty courts. These were maritime courts operating without a jury, where the technical evidence of piracy on the high seas was met with the mechanical application of the law. You stand upon the muddy banks of the Thames at Execution Dock, observing the apparatus of the short drop. Unlike the modern long drop method designed to snap the neck for an instantaneous execution, utilized a short rope. The technical result was not a broken neck, but a protracted physiological collapse. As the cart pulled away, the weight of the condemned was supported entirely by the constriction of the trachea and the carotid arteries. You witnessed the slow strangulation, a process where the heart continued to pump against a blocked airway, lasting anywhere from 10 to 45 minutes. The spectators in the crowd observed the hempen jig, the involuntary muscular spasms of the legs as the body's oxygen saturation plummeted. The sensory environment is defined by the sharp, briny smell of the mudflats and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the wooden platform. The year 1726 marked a terminal point in this industrial-scale purging of the Atlantic. You watched the execution of William Fly in Boston, a man who refused to show the expected contrition, even straightening the noose with his own hands before the end. Many historians point to Fly's death as the definitive conclusion of the golden age of piracy. The defiance of the individual was no longer a match for the logistical reach of the Royal Navy and the unwavering bureaucracy of the colonial governors. The Brotherhood of the Sea, which had once governed its own republic through articles and elections, had been reduced to a series of singular executions designed to reinforce the sanctity of private property and trade routes. The finality of the sentence was not reached when the pulse stopped, but through the treatment of the remains. For the most notorious offenders, the Admiralty ordered gibbeting. You see the blacksmiths measuring the cooling corpse for an iron cage, a custom-fitted structural frame designed to prevent the body from falling apart as it decayed. These cages were suspended from high gallows at the harbour entrances. The legal directive required the bodies to be left submerged by the rising tides. Typically, they were to stay until 3 tides had washed over them. You hear the cold rhythmic lapping of the tide against a hanging cage. The metallic clinking of the rusted chains in the wind served as a navigational marker for incoming merchant ships, a grim reminder that the era of the black flag was over. The golden age vanished into the mist, leaving behind only the myths we tell today.